The wind in Wyoming territory doesn't just blow, it talks. In the winter of 1872, it had one story to tell: ruin. It sang across the open range in a thin, lonesome whistle, scouring stubbled grass down to frozen dirt and stacking snow into drifts so high they swallowed fence posts and made the road vanish like chalk in rain. Eli McCrae knew that voice better than any neighbor's hello. He moved through the pre-dawn gray of his cabin by habit, every step a negotiation with the old bullet wound in his left thigh. Years back, a stupid feud over cattle and a hot-headed kid with faster hands had given him that limp, and taken more than just a clean stride. When the weather was about to break bad, that leg spoke up before the clouds ever did. This morning it throbbed deep and sure, more snow coming. The ranch was hardly more than a stubborn scratch of humanity on a huge white canvas. A snug, square log cabin he'd notched and stacked himself. A barn that leaned north like it was bowing to the everlasting wind. A rough corral, and 2 horses he trusted more than most folks. That was the whole kingdom now. After Sarah, well, the world had shrunk down to chores and daylight. He fed the horses with breath smoking in the air, rubbed a mitten over Jericho's warm neck, and cracked ice out of the trough with the pole of his axe. The sound snapped across the quiet, then the wind swallowed it. Eli wasn't much for words. Hadn't been since he stopped having someone to talk to. The lines at the corners of his eyes came from squinting against sun and snow, not from laughing. He'd turned his thoughts inward the way a man banks a fire, low, steady, private. Redemption, the nearest town, was fading same as winter killed the grass, slow and sure. It clung to the railroad like a burr on a wool coat. Most folks just passed through. Eli rode in once a month for flour, coffee, salt, and news he pretended not to want. He kept to nods and short answers. People knew enough of his story to give him space, and he let them keep the rest. He should have been riding out that day with a wagon load of salt licks and a coil of barbed wire, both 3 weeks late. But the trains were at the mercy of snow-choked passes in the Laramie Mountains. He saddled Jericho anyway, leather stiff with cold, set his hat low, pulled the sheepskin collar up high, and pushed into a world scrubbed of color, sky like dishwater, land like a blank page. Cottonwoods along the creek showed their black bones, and thin smoke from 2 homesteads wrote little lines against the gray. The station at Redemption was a wooden box with a pot-bellied stove and a telegraph key clicking to places that felt made up. Jeb Finch, the station master, was sweeping half-heartedly at snow blown in under the door. "She's late, McCrae," he grunted without looking up. "Tracks are buried past Cheyenne. Might be tomorrow, might be Easter." Eli gave the smallest nod and let his eyes drift past Finch to the platform. That's where he saw her. She sat at the far end, still as a forgotten statue. A dark coat too thin for Wyoming winter wrapped tight, snow melting into the fabric. A tiny scuffed bridle trunk rested at her boots. She held a letter like it was the last warm thing on earth. Finch followed Eli's gaze and sighed. "Been here since the morning train from the east. Supposed to be met." He lowered his voice, though there was no one around to overhear. "Mail order bride. Not the first I've seen. Her fella never showed. She didn't look at them. Her eyes stayed on the tracks, jaw set in a straight line you could cut your thumb on. Pride can be brittle. It keeps you upright when everything else starts to fold." "She can't stay," Finch muttered, now talking to the problem instead of the man. "Night train's canceled. I close at dusk. No hotel worth the word. Martha won't take a woman without bona fides. You know how it is, Eli did." He also knew the wind didn't care about manners, and that platform would turn a person to ice. He turned to leave, the sensible choice, and didn't. Couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the wind plastered a pale strand of hair across her cheek. Maybe it was the look in her eyes when she finally glanced his way. Storm gray, haunted, and somehow still stubborn. In that empty gaze, he recognized something that lived in him too. Bone deep alone. "What's her name?" Eli asked, surprising Finch and himself. "Whitmore. Clara Whitmore." Finch's brows ticked up. Eli McCrae wasn't known for taking interest. "She says she can't go back east," Finch added. "No money for the ticket, I reckon." Eli crossed the planks, limp more noticeable when the cold bit hard. The crunch under his boots was the only sound besides the wind. He stopped a few feet short. When she finally looked up, she flinched like his voice might hurt. "Ma'am," he said softly. "Sir?" The word came out hoarse, barely there. "Station master says your party didn't arrive." Delicate phrasing wasn't his trade. A tired, crooked smile touched her mouth. That's one way to put it. She glanced at the letter, then the empty rails. He is not coming. The way she said it, like a door closing on a warm room, put a chill under his coat. The weather's turning, Eli said. It's not safe out here. Finch is closing up. Her eyes met his, and behind the pride he saw it, real fear. I don't know where to go. Truth doesn't need decoration. It just lands. Out here, a woman alone drew gossip first and danger second. Redemption wouldn't open doors. It would open mouths. Eli thought about his fire, about quiet, about the life he'd built with walls higher than the Tetons. Bringing her there would bust all of that to pieces. Complications, questions, gossip that could grow teeth. I've got a cabin, he heard himself say. Not much, but it's warm. You can stay the night. Till the storm passes. Her eyes widened. She searched his face for the hook men sometimes hide in kindness. A lifetime of sermons and rules had taught her there's always a price. Eli's face didn't help. Hard lines, shadowed eyes, but his voice stayed steady. I could not impose, she tried, pride and desperation wrestling in her chest. It's that or freeze, he said. Not pity, not persuasion, just fact. The wind don't care about propriety, ma'am. Another gust slapped the platform. The fight drained a little from her shoulders. She nodded once. Thank you. He lifted her trunk, heavier than it looked, heavy like dashed hopes, and slung it onto his shoulder. Come on, fair walk. They left Redemption, two figures cutting into deepening snow. The wind shoved at their backs like an impatient hand. Twice she stumbled. City shoes weren't made for rutted ground crusted with ice. He offered his arm once. She refused it with a small shake. Some flames you keep alive by pure stubbornness. By the time the cabin came into view, square logs, chinked tight stone chimney breathing smoke, the world was already dimming. For Clara, near frozen and wrung out, it looked like a miracle. Inside, heat hit like a body blow. Fire flamed high, throwing orange against wood walls planed rough and scrubbed clean. One room, a narrow bed built into a wall with a thick gray blanket, a table and two chairs, shelves stacked tidy with tins and folded shirts. A man's place, a fortress of order. She stood by the door, dripping onto the plank floor, arms around herself like she was holding the last of her dignity together. Now that the sting was leaving her skin, the shaking started in earnest, jaw chattering so hard it looked painful. Eli put another log on the fire and grabbed his old sheepskin from the peg by the door. It smelled like wood smoke and cold outdoors. Here, he said, holding it out. Yours is soaked through. For a heartbeat, she just stared, as if the coat were a language she'd forgotten. Then she shrugged out of her wet, thin thing and into his. It swallowed her to the knees. The sleeves hid her hands. She fumbled at the buttons with numb fingers. He didn't step closer. Didn't help. Just held the coat steady until she managed. Then nodded once like a man satisfied a gate was latched. Thank you, she whispered to the fire. It sounded like the first soft word she'd spoken in months. He poured 2 tin cups of coffee, black, bitter, life-saving, and set one near her. She murmured thanks again without turning. He took the chair by the door, eyes on the window where snow was already piling like a wall. That one night he'd offered? The storm outside had other ideas. When gray faded to black, she spoke in a small voice. I can sleep by the hearth. I won't be any trouble. He looked from the hard floor to the bed, then at the set of her shoulders. You take the bed. The words came iron flat. No, that is you're my guest. The word felt odd in his mouth. You're freezing. You'll take the bed. He carried his empty cup to the dry sink. I'll sleep by the door. I'm used to it. Arguing took energy she didn't have. She nodded. He laid a spare blanket on the floor near the threshold, a silent promise to stand between her and the night. She stayed close to the fire a long time, palms hovering over flames she couldn't feel through the heavy coat. At last she unrolled onto the bed with her boots kicked off and her pride still laced tight. He sat a while, watching the flames settle into coals, listening to the wind claw at the cabin. He'd let the world in. The echo of Sarah's name moved through him like a shadow. He lay down on the floor only when the fire sank low. Deep in the night, when even the wind sounded tired, he heard it. A small, smothered sob. He didn't move. A second one. He lay still, eyes open to the dark, and let her keep her dignity. She cried into the collar of his old coat, the same one wrapping her now. She cried for a man who never came, for a father's rules that tightened like a rope. for the empty track and the long white miles. And Eli on the floor by the door felt the ice around his heart creak. Morning wasn't so much sunrise as it was the gray getting lighter. The wind had found new teeth. She woke stiff in his bed, mortification hitting before memory. This is his space. I am in it. His blanket near the door was folded neat. He wasn't there. Then the door swung open on a breath of needles cold air, and he came in with an armful of wood, coat rimed with frost. He stacked the logs, turned, and met her eyes. No greeting. Just a short nod. Storm's holding, he said. We're not going anywhere for a few days. A few days. The words weighed heavy. She pulled the sheepskin closer around her shoulders, then tried to give it back. I must repay your kindness, she said, formal as a church altar. Let me cook, clean, I have to be useful. He looked at her a long beat, at the new lines worry had drawn around her mouth, at the set of her chin that dared him to refuse. Coffee's on the stove, he said, turning to the hearth. Salt pork and flour in the larder. Do as you please. Not an invitation so much as permission. It was enough. By noon there were biscuits on the table and the floor was swept. Eli moved in the white blur between cabin and barn, returning rhymed and silent, tackling tack and knives with meticulous hands. He didn't miss much. The yellowed scabs along her knuckles spoke of scrubbing floors until they bled. The way she flinched at a log dropped too hard said more than any confession. She moved like a stray cat, ready to bolt, too tired to run. 3 days the wind howled and the snow packed them in. On the 4th the sky went high and pale, the land bright as a silver coin. The silence in the cabin didn't break, it changed. That night, with beans and biscuits cooling between them, Clara finally chose to speak. She didn't owe him her story, but the man had given her a roof and asked for nothing. He deserved a little light. My father is a minister, she said to her plate. Our house was orderly. The word tasted like dust. There wasn't room for mistakes, she breathed, steadying. I was promised to a man from church. A good man, they said. His hands were always cold. Eli didn't move. Didn't ask. Just listened. In the quiet, it felt like the first real conversation either of them had had in a long, long time. The snow stopped 2 days later, leaving the world white and wordless. The silence outside the cabin felt thick enough to touch, the kind of quiet that made a man's thoughts loud. Eli stood on the porch with an axe in his hands, splitting wood into clean, sharp halves. Each swing was a rhythm he understood, a man, a tool, a task. The wind still nipped, but the sky had cleared into something fierce and blue. Inside, Clara moved like a ghost who'd learned how to breathe again. The warmth of the cabin had brought color back to her face. Her dress, wrinkled from travel, stained by snow, now hung near the fire, steaming slowly back to life. She wore one of Eli's flannel shirts, sleeves rolled high on her forearms. The sight startled him more than he'd admit. It looked wrong and right at once, fragile fabric on borrowed strength. He set down the axe, leaning it against the rail, and stepped inside. You been busy, he said, his voice low. Clara turned from the table, where she'd arranged the space into something almost homelike. Didn't seem right to sit idle while you worked. Eli looked at the neat stack of wood, the swept floor, the biscuits wrapped in a clean cloth. Don't recall asking you to. She bristled slightly. Would you rather I sat and did nothing? He wiped snow from his hat brim, a faint smile hiding in his beard. No, ma'am. I reckon not. For a moment they stood there, the fire crackling between them. She watched the light flicker over his face. A man built from stone and scar, carrying something behind his eyes that words couldn't touch. Mr. McCrae, she said finally. When the storm clears, I'll find a way to pay you back for all this. He set his hat on the peg and glanced out the frosted window. Didn't do it for pay. Then why? He hesitated. The truth was too heavy for a single breath. Because once, he said quietly, someone did the same for me. That evening they shared dinner at the table. 2 plates, 1 lantern, and silence that wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Clara ate slow, her hands delicate but sure. Eli watched the way the firelight danced in her hair, catching the copper strands hidden in the brown. You built this place yourself, she said. Mostly. You must have had help. He shook his head. Didn't want any. Why not? Help means questions. Questions mean talk. And talk's a dangerous habit out here. Clara tilted her head. You speak as though you've got something to hide. Eli's eyes flicked to the window where the reflection of the fire blurred against the dark. Everyone's hiding something, ma'am. The difference is I don't pretend I'm not. She wanted to ask more, about the limp, the sadness that seemed to live behind his calm, but something in his tone made her stop. They were two strangers bound by weather, not trust, so instead she said softly, "You can call me Clara." Eli's gaze met hers, steady and unreadable. "Then you'd best call me Eli." The days folded into a quiet rhythm. Clara mended torn shirts, cooked what little they had, and learned to chop wood without splitting her thumb. Eli worked outside, mending fences and clearing snow. When the evenings came, they'd sit near the fire, she reading from a small, tattered book she'd carried from the train, he listening in silence. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was something close. One night, as she read aloud, her voice faltered. "Sorry," she said, blinking hard. "This part reminds me of home." Eli didn't move. "That where your father is?" She nodded. "In Kansas." "He won't take me back." "Not after—" She stopped, catching herself. He waited, but she didn't go on. Instead, she stared into the flames until her eyes glistened. He spoke finally, voice rough as gravel. "There's things a person don't have to explain to be forgiven." She looked at him, the lamplight trembling between them. "You talk like a man who's tried." He met her gaze without flinching. "You talk like a woman who hasn't." The silence that followed wasn't sharp. It was deep. On the fifth day, the sun rose bright and hard. The snow crusted thick enough to hold a horse's weight. Eli hitched Jericho and turned toward the horizon. "Trail's open again," he said. "I'll ride into Redemption for supplies." Clara's face shifted, something between relief and fear. "Should I come?" "Better you stay. Roads'll be half mud by noon." She nodded, though her hands twisted the hem of the borrowed shirt. "You'll come back?" Eli looked at her like she'd asked whether the sun planned to rise. "Ain't much sense leaving my own cabin behind." He rode out through the frozen light, the air sharp and clean. Clara watched until the sound of hooves faded, leaving only wind and the sigh of the chimney. Inside, the cabin felt suddenly too big. She busied herself with chores that didn't need doing. Swept the same floor twice, re-washed a clean pan. Every creak of the walls made her look toward the door. She didn't understand why the silence now felt heavier than the storm had. When Eli returned near dusk, he wasn't alone. A man rode behind him, younger, leaner, with a face that had seen too many towns and too little mercy. His coat was black, his grin mean. Eli dismounted slow. "Clara," he said, his tone unreadable. "This is Frank Danner. He works out past Red Ridge." Frank tipped his hat, eyes crawling over her like smoke. "Ma'am," Clara's stomach nodded. "Mr. Danner." Eli unloaded the supplies, ignoring the look in the man's eyes. But when Danner spoke again, the air in the room changed. "Didn't know you took in boarders, Eli. Folks in town'll talk." Eli's jaw clenched. "Then they'll have to find new words," Frank smirked. "Careful. You might start sounding like you care what happens to her." Eli didn't move, but the firelight caught the edge of something sharp behind his calm. "You done here?" Frank chuckled, hands raised in mock surrender. "Don't get sore. Just friendly conversation." He turned to Clara, his grin too wide. "You be careful out here, ma'am. Lonely places make men forget themselves." Clara forced a polite nod. "Thank you for the warning." He rode off into the dark, leaving only the crunch of snow and the low, steady sound of Eli's breath. She turned toward him, voice trembling. "He meant to scare me." Eli looked out the window, jaw tight. "He meant worse." That night, neither of them slept much. Clara lay awake, staring at the fire, hearing every sound outside, every gust, every shift in the timber. Somewhere near dawn, she rose quietly and crossed the cabin. Eli sat by the door, rifle resting across his knees. "You think he'll come back?" she whispered. Eli didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the window. "Men like him don't forget things that bother him, and I reckon I bothered him plenty." She wrapped her arms around herself. "You helped me. Now I've brought trouble to your door." Eli shook his head. "Trouble finds its own way here." "Always does." He turned then, meeting her eyes in the dim light. "But you're safe, Clara. Long as I'm breathing, you're safe." Her breath caught at the quiet certainty in his voice. "Why?" she asked. He looked back to the fire, the reflection burning in his eyes. "Because I couldn't save the last one." Morning came slow, pale and brittle. The sun rose behind the snow-capped ridge like a memory too shy to show its face. Clara stood at the cabin window, fingers wrapped around a cup gone cold, watching the light spill across the drifts. Eli was outside already, chopping kindling near the barn. His motions were clean, practiced, like a man who had spent years learning to keep his thoughts busy. But today the rhythm fell off. There was tension in his shoulders, something coiled beneath the quiet. Clara saw it and knew it wasn't the cold. Frank Danner's visit had left a shadow across the place, the kind that didn't melt with sunlight. When Eli came back inside, his coat was lined with frost. He set the axe against the wall, brushed snow from his gloves, and spoke without looking at her. "Town'll be talking by now." Clara's voice was small but steady. "Let them talk," he shook his head. "Talk can get a woman run out of redemption, sometimes worse." She drew herself up, pride cutting through the fear. "You think I should hide?" Eli met her gaze then, a hard look softened by something almost like concern. "I think you should stay alive." By noon the wind had picked up again, carrying with it the smell of trouble. Eli noticed it first, not the scent itself, but the way the horses snorted and turned restless in their stalls. He stepped out to calm them, hand brushing the worn handle of the revolver at his hip. For years it had sat there out of habit, not need. Today it felt heavier. That was when he saw the tracks. 3 sets of hoof prints coming up from the ridge, the snow still clean around the edges. Fresh. Eli followed them halfway to the tree line before stopping. Men didn't ride this far from town without reason. He turned back toward the cabin, the weight of decision already pressing on him. Inside, Clara was sewing at the table. Her face lifted when he entered, hopeful almost, but the look in his eyes stopped her before she could speak. "Pack what you need," he said. Her needle froze mid-stitch. "Why, what is it?" "Trouble. How close?" He glanced toward the window. "Close enough." She rose, trembling hands fumbling at the table. "Is it that man, Danner?" Eli nodded once. "He don't ride alone." Clara's pulse thudded in her ears. "What does he want?" Eli didn't answer. Some truths did more harm spoken aloud. By the time the riders appeared, the sun had already started to fall behind the pines. 3 dark shapes against the white. Danner and 2 others, one with a rifle slung lazy across his saddle. They stopped a few yards from the porch. Danner grinned up at Eli, who stood in the doorway, rifle resting casual against his shoulder. "Afternoon," Danner drawled. "Didn't mean to disturb your hospitality." Eli didn't blink. "You're doing it anyway." The man laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Word in town says you're harboring a runaway bride. Thought maybe I'd check if that was true." Clara stood behind Eli, barely visible through the crack of the door. The word bride hit like a thrown stone. She wanted to disappear. "She's under my roof," Eli said. "That's all you need to know." "That's so." Danner dismounted, boots crunching in the snow. "See, I got a letter says otherwise." "From her fiancé?" Clara's breath caught. Eli didn't move. "Her fiancé's got no claim here." Danner smirked. "Ain't about claims, friend. It's about what's owed. And I figure you owe me for the insult you threw in town." The air went thin between them. The wind had gone quiet. Even the horses stilled. Eli's voice came low and cold. "I don't pay debts to men like you." Danner's grin widened. "Then you'll pay in blood." The first shot cracked like a whip. Snow burst from the porch rail. Clara screamed, dropping behind the table. Eli fired back once, the rifle's echo rolling through the valley. One of Danner's men toppled from his horse. "Stay down," he shouted, grabbing the revolver from his belt. Glass shattered as another bullet tore through the window. Clara crawled across the floor, heart hammering. She found the spare rifle propped by the hearth, one Sarah's brother had left behind long ago, and clutched it tight, though she didn't know how to aim it. Outside, Danner fired again, laughing through the smoke. "Come on, McCrae. Let's see if you still shoot straight." Eli crouched near the doorway, eyes narrow, breath steady. He'd fought before, for cattle, for money, for pride, but never for something that felt like this. He caught a glimpse of movement by the barn, the second gunman circling wide. He leaned out, fired twice, and the man dropped, face first into the snow. That left Danner. Silence fell again, thick as the clouds above. Eli stepped out onto the porch, snow crunching under his boots. His shadow stretched long in the late light. "End this now," he said. Danner straightened. gun still in hand. You could have kept to yourself, Eli. You and your pretty stray. But you had to play the hero. Wasn't about heroics, Eli said quietly. Was about decency. Something you wouldn't understand. Danner lifted his revolver, smile curling. Then I'll teach you what it costs. The next moment stretched thin as wire. 2 shots. 1 echo. Eli stood still for a long second, the world spinning slow around him. Then his knees buckled. Clara screamed his name. She ran to him, snow soaking her skirts, hands catching his shoulders before he fell. Blood seeped dark through his coat, steam rising where it met the cold. Danner staggered backward, his own gun smoking, disbelief twisting his face. A crimson bloom spread across his chest. He fell hard, eyes open to the gray sky. Clara pressed her hands against Eli's wound, voice breaking. Don't you dare die on me, please. He coughed once, lips curling into a faint smile. Guess we both got lucky. Lucky? She gasped. He reached weakly, brushing his thumb against her cheek. You're still breathing. Then his head dropped back, eyes rolling shut. The world blurred. Hours later, or maybe minutes, Clara sat by the hearth, pressing cloth to his wound, praying words she hadn't said in years. Eli stirred once, fevered, muttering names she didn't know. Then he went still again. Outside, the snow began to fall in soft, endless, erasing every track from the fight. Clara looked through the window into that clean white world, tears burning her eyes. Whatever she'd been before, a runaway bride, a secret, a scandal, she wasn't that anymore. Not now. Now she was the woman who'd fight to keep him alive. The storm returned 2 days later, wind howling over the ridge, snow driving hard against the cabin walls. The world outside vanished in white, leaving only the sound of fire and breath inside. Eli McCrae hovered between life and death. The bullet had gone through clean, missing his heart by inches but tearing deep into his side. Clara did what she could. Boiled water, cleaned the wound, pressed rags until her arms shook. He drifted in and out, fever burning him from within. Sometimes he called out names she didn't know. Sarah, Ben, Ma. Sometimes he whispered hers, soft as the wind. She barely slept. The fire never went out. When at last the snow eased and light crept through the frosted window, she dared to hope. His color was coming back. His breathing steadied, but outside she knew danger hadn't melted with the snow. Frank Danner's body still lay by the barn, half buried under drifts. Sooner or later the town would come asking questions. It was near dusk when the first rider appeared, a single dark shape against the pale horizon. Clara froze at the window. He rode slow, deliberate, the way lawmen do when they already know what they'll find. By the time he reached the porch, Eli was awake, weak, but aware. He tried to sit up. Clara was beside him in an instant, pressing a hand to his chest. Don't, she whispered. You'll open the wound again. He grimaced. Who's out there? Someone coming from town. I think it's the sheriff. Eli's jaw tightened. Then it's time. She looked at him, confusion flashing through her exhaustion. Time for what? He didn't answer. Just reached for his coat and pulled a small iron key from the inside pocket. There's a box under the floorboards by the stove. Bring it, Clara hesitated. Eli, please. The word wasn't a command. It was a plea. She knelt, pried up the loose plank, and found a small metal box no bigger than a Bible. Inside lay an old badge, tarnished by years and regret. Her breath caught. You were... He nodded once. Deputy U.S. Marshal a long time ago. The knock on the door was sharp, official. McCrae? The voice outside was steady, low. Clara opened the door halfway. A tall man stood on the porch, his coat rimed with frost, his eyes hidden under the brim of a black hat. The brass star pinned to his chest caught the light. Sheriff Cal Dorsey, Redemption County, he said. I need to speak with Eli McCrae. Clara's pulse quickened. He's hurt. He can't, I know, Dorsey said gently. That's why I'm here. He stepped inside without waiting for permission, snow trailing behind his boots. His gaze swept the room, the bandages, the blood-stained cloths, the rifle by the door. Then it landed on Eli, pale but upright against the pillows. Hell, the sheriff muttered. Didn't expect to see you breathing. Eli gave a weak grin. Didn't expect to be, Cal. Clara looked between them, realization dawning. You know him? Used to, Dorsey said. We rode together for the marshal's office back before he vanished off the map. He stepped closer to the bed. You shot Frank Danner? Eli's voice was steady, though his breath was shallow. He gave me no choice. He came here gunning for blood. That what this is? Dorsey asked. Self-defense? Eli nodded once. You can check the tracks yourself. Not that they'll show much in this weather. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. Town's already buzzing. Danner wasn't liked, but he was feared. His brothers'll want answers. Eli's jaw tightened. They'll get the truth. Nothing more. Dorsey looked past him to Clara, who stood near the fire, hands clasped tight. And you, ma'am. You're the woman folks are talking about. She flinched. What are they saying? That you ran from a marriage in Kansas. That a man named Royce Tanner paid for you to come west, then sent Danner to fetch you back when you didn't show. Her face went pale. That's not true. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. Then tell me what is. She drew a slow, trembling breath. Royce Tanner wasn't my fiancé. He was my father's choice, a deal struck to pay church debts. I refused. My father said I brought shame on the family, so I left. Tanner sent men after me, saying I was his by law. Dorsey's eyes softened. And Danner? Her voice shook. He said he'd escort me safely. If I agreed to him instead. She swallowed hard. When I refused, he made sure I'd be stranded. That's why I was on that platform. The sheriff was silent for a moment, then nodded. That sounds like Danner. He looked to Eli. You did right, though the law'll want paper to prove it. Eli exhaled, relief and pain tangled together. I'm done running from the law, Cal. Do what you gotta do. Dorsey gave him a long look, then smiled faintly. I reckon I just did. As far as I'm concerned, this was self-defense. You won't hear otherwise from me. Clara's eyes welled. Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet, he said, pulling his hat back on. Danner's kin might come hunting. You'll want to keep watch. He tipped his hat, turned to the door, and left into the snow. Night fell soft and quiet again. The worst of the storm had passed. Clara sat by the bed, tending the fire, while Eli dozed. His breathing had steadied. His color had returned. When he opened his eyes, she was still there, her face pale from exhaustion, hair loose around her shoulders. You should rest, he murmured. So should you. He smiled faintly. You're stubborn. I learned from the best. She brushed a hand against his forehead. Cool. Gentle. For the first time in days, his fever was gone. Eli, she said softly, why did you leave the marshals? He hesitated, eyes fixed on the fire. Because I shot the wrong man. She said nothing, waiting. He took a breath. A rancher we'd been chasing. Thought he was leading a gang robbing the mail routes. I cornered him near Dry Creek. He drew fast, I drew faster. Turns out, he wasn't armed. Just reaching for a badge in his coat pocket. Deputy out of Denver. Clara's heart tightened. You couldn't have known. Didn't matter, he said quietly. The man's wife thought it did. Whole town did, so I quit. Buried the badge. Figured I'd never wear honor again. She looked at him for a long moment, tears glinting in the firelight. Then let me tell you what I see. He turned to her, eyes shadowed. I see a man who gave shelter to a stranger when no one else would. Who stood up to men with guns to keep me safe. Who risked his life and still says he's unworthy. Eli's throat worked, words caught somewhere between shame and gratitude. Clara, she leaned closer, her hand trembling on his. If that's not honor, then the world's forgotten what the word means. For the first time in years, Eli McCrae looked at another human being and didn't feel the weight of ghosts pressing between them. The fire burned low, crackling soft, and outside the wind fell quiet. Two people, both wounded, both weary, and sat together in the silence. And for the first time since the storm began, neither of them felt alone. The thaw came slow that year, snow melting from the high ridges into thin silver streams that braided through the grasslands. The air smelled of damp earth and pine sap, and each morning brought the sound of dripping from the cabin roof. Eli McCrae was on his feet again, though slower than before. The wound ached when the wind shifted, and sometimes he'd stop mid-step, breathing through the pain until it passed. Clara pretended not to notice, but she always hovered close. Pretending to busy herself with the kettle or the woodpile, they had fallen into a rhythm, a fragile peace built from small things, shared coffee, the sound of the creek, the unspoken comfort of knowing someone else was listening to the same quiet. At night, they talked, and not much, but enough to remind each other they were still human. Clara told him about Kansas, about the smell of rain on the wheat fields and how her mother used to sing while hanging laundry. Eli told her about the ranch he'd lost years before, about Sarah, his sister, not a wife, who'd been killed in a range war when he was still too young to understand how grief grows roots. The past hung between them like smoke, but it no longer suffocated. It softened, became something shared instead of secret. By April, the passes had opened again, and the road to redemption was dry enough for wagon wheels. Sheriff Dorsey stopped by on his way north, bringing supplies and word from town. He dismounted near the fence, tipping his hat toward Clara as she came out with a bucket. "Afternoon, ma'am. McCrae around." Eli appeared from behind the barn, sleeves rolled up, a streak of sweat cutting through the dust on his jaw. "I'm here." Dorsey handed him a folded sheet of paper. "Letter came in on the mail coach. Thought you'd want it quick." Eli unfolded it, eyes scanning the page. His jaw tightened as he read. Clara watched, uneasy. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. Then in that low gravel voice he said, "Danner had 2 brothers. They're coming." Dorsey nodded grimly. "I figured as much. They've been asking questions in town. Mean ones. Word is they're riding this way by week's end." Clara felt her stomach turn. "What do they want?" Eli met her eyes. "Vengeance," Dorsey set his hat back on. "I'll do what I can to slow them down, but they don't care for law. You'd best be ready." Eli's hand tightened on the paper. "Always am." That night the mood in the cabin changed. Clara cooked in silence while Eli cleaned his rifle. Every movement was deliberate, calm, but the calm of a man standing at the edge of something he'd hoped never to face again. "You can still go," he said quietly when she set his plate down. "Go where?" "Anywhere. There's a freight wagon leaving for Cheyenne in 3 days. You'd be safe there." She stared at him, then shook her head. "I'm done running. Clara—" "No," she said, her voice fierce enough to stop him. "You think you're the only one who's tired of fear? I've spent my whole life doing what men told me was safe. I won't leave you here alone." Eli looked at her for a long time, something raw and almost tender flickering in his eyes. "You'll stay then." "I will. Then we'll be ready." They prepared quietly side by side. Eli checked the ammunition, mended the fence, and reinforced the shutters. Clara gathered food, water, and cloth for bandages, things a woman learns to think of when she's seen what bullets can do. On the 3rd night, the wind changed direction, blowing up from the valley with the faint smell of campfire smoke. Eli stepped out onto the porch, his silhouette sharp against the dim lantern glow. He didn't say a word, but Clara knew. "They're here," she whispered. "Not yet," he said. "But soon." He stayed outside a long time, listening to the night, the crickets gone silent. When he finally came back in, he found her sitting at the table, head bowed over folded hands. "I ain't much for praying," he said quietly. She looked up, her eyes shining in the low light. "Then I'll do it for both of us." They came just before dawn. 3 riders this time, dark shapes cutting through the fog that clung to the creek bed. The first light of morning glinted off gunmetal. Eli was already waiting by the porch rail, rifle cradled in his hands. Clara stood behind the window, the second rifle ready though her fingers trembled. The men drew up near the fence, their leader, tall, lean, same mean grin as Frank, calling out, "You McCrae?" "I am. You killed our brother." Eli's voice was calm. "He came here to kill me first. That don't matter none. It does to me." The man spat in the snow. "You could hand over the woman." "Make it easy," Eli's jaw set. "No. Then we'll take her off your corpse." And just like that, the world exploded. The first shot split the morning clean in half. Eli fired back, one man dropping before his horse even bucked. Clara flinched at the sound, her heart hammering, but she didn't hide. She loaded another round and steadied her aim, remembering the way Eli had taught her to breathe. Through the smoke, one of the brothers rushed the porch, firing wild. Eli's rifle jammed, just a click and silence. He ducked, grabbed the revolver from his belt, and met the man halfway. The two collided hard, a tangle of fists and fury. Clara saw steel flash, heard Eli grunt in pain, and something inside her snapped. She kicked the door open, raised the rifle, and fired. The man fell backward into the snow, red blooming beneath him. Eli turned, blood on his sleeve, but still standing. The last brother was already fleeing, spooked horse tearing down the ridge. Eli raised his revolver, hesitated him, and lowered it. Let him go, Clara whispered. He nodded once. He'll tell the rest. But maybe they'll think twice. When the quiet finally came back, it felt different. Heavier. Deeper. Eli leaned against the porch rail, breathing hard, blood dripping from his arm. Clara ran to him, hands shaking. You're hit. He looked down at the grays and managed a tired smile. Not bad. You're a good shot. She let out a shaky laugh. Beginner's luck. He brushed a thumb against her cheek, smearing a streak of soot. No, Clara, that was courage. She swallowed hard. You'd have done the same for me. Maybe, he said softly. But I ain't sure I'd have done it half as steady. She looked up at him, tears cutting clean lines through the dirt on her face. It's over now, isn't it? Eli glanced out at the snow, where two dark shapes lay still. For now. He took her hand, his grip rough but sure. Come on, sun'll be up soon. Let's bury him before the ground hardens again. By midday, the graves were done. 2 mounds at the edge of the clearing, marked by simple stones. When it was finished, Eli leaned on his shovel, sweat freezing at his collar. Clara stepped beside him, silent. They were men once, he said. Same as me. Just lost their way. She touched his arm gently. Then maybe you helped them find the end of it. He looked at her then. Really looked. At the woman who'd walked through fear and fire to stand beside him. You didn't have to stay, he said quietly. I know. Why did you? She smiled faintly. Because the world's too big for one kind heart to stand alone. He let out a slow breath. The kind that carries more than air. I reckon you're right. That night, when the stars came out over the valley, they sat on the porch together in the quiet. No words, no ghosts, just the creek whispering below and the wind finally gentle for once. Eli reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he'd buried long ago. The faint, dangerous promise of peace. And this time, he didn't turn from it. The spring thaw rolled into early summer, turning the valley green again. Meltwater from the mountains fed the creek until it sang louder than the wind. And wildflowers speckled the hillsides where bullets had fallen months before. To look at Willow Creek Ranch now, no one would guess how close death had come to it. The graves by the ridge were slowly being claimed by grass, the wood markers silvering in the sun. Only Eli and Clara knew what slept beneath that soil, and neither spoke of it. Eli's wound had healed clean, though the scar drew tight when he worked too hard. Clara nagged him about it, gently, always, and he'd answer with a small, guilty grin. You tell me not to lift the fence post, and I tell you I'll stop after this one, he'd say. We both know who wins. Life, for a while, was made of such small things, but peace, like any wild creature, never stayed too long in one place. By midsummer, the road to town had dried enough for wagons, and Sheriff Dorsey came riding in one morning with dust on his hat and worry on his face. McCrae, he called, swinging down from the saddle. We need to talk. Eli wiped his hands on a rag, sensing the weight in Dorsey's tone. Something wrong? Depends on your definition. Clara came out from the cabin, drying her hands. Dorsey nodded to her politely, then turned back to Eli. Word's spreading, he said. A ranch hand who passed through saw the graves up by your ridge. Claimed he recognized one of the Danner boys. Now their kin in Cheyenne are stirring talk, saying you executed them, not defended yourself. Eli's eyes darkened. That's a lie, Dorsey sighed. Truth don't travel half as fast as rumor. Marshal service is sniffing around again. They're looking for the man who used to wear their badge. Clara froze. They know about you? Maybe not yet, Dorsey said, but they will. And if they find out what happened here, 3 men dead, buried quiet, they'll want answers that don't fit in the law books. Eli looked out at the horizon, where the mountains burned blue in the morning haze. What are you saying, Cal? I'm saying you got 2 choices. Go into town and face them on your own terms, or wait till they come here and turn it into another gunfight. That night, the decision hung heavy between them. Eli sat by the fire, cleaning his revolver, not out of intent, but habit. Clara watched from the table, her hands tight around a mug gone cold. You'll go, she said finally. He didn't answer. You can't hide forever, she went on. You said once that you were done running. He glanced up, eyes soft with something between pride and sorrow. And if I don't come back? She rose, walked to him, and took the gun gently from his hands. Then you'll come back anyway. Because I'll be here waiting. Eli exhaled slow and deep. You got a stubborn streak, Clara Whitmore. She smiled faintly. I learned from the best. 2 days later, he rode into redemption. The town hadn't changed much. Still a stretch of weathered buildings along a dusty street. Still the smell of coffee and horses and sweat. But the faces turned as he passed. Some nodded, others whispered. He tied Jericho outside the sheriff's office and stepped inside. Dorsey was waiting, along with 2 men in dark coats, marshals from Cheyenne, the silver badges catching the lamplight. The older one stood tall, iron-gray beard, eyes that had seen too much. Elias McCrae, he said. Didn't expect to find you this far north. Didn't expect you to come looking, Eli replied. We heard about the Danner boys. Eli met his gaze squarely. Then you heard wrong. They came here looking for blood. I gave them a fair warning and a fair fight. The marshal folded his arms. That's not what their kin say. Kin weren't there. The room went quiet except for the tick of the clock. Dorsey watched, tension coiled in his jaw. Finally, the marshal said, You could make this easier on yourself. Come to Cheyenne, give a statement, let the circuit judge decide. Eli smiled, but it wasn't friendly. You think a judge will care about truth or about whose pockets the Danners fill? The younger marshal shifted uneasily. You talking like a guilty man, McCrae. Eli turned to him, calm as winter. No, I'm talking like a man who's done this before. The older marshal studied him a long moment. Then he said quietly, You were a good lawman once. Folks said you had a steady hand and a conscience that wouldn't quit. Eli's mouth twitched. Maybe too much of both. What happened to you? He hesitated, then said, I stopped believing the law could tell right from wrong. The older man nodded slowly. Then maybe you're wiser than most. He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper, and handed it to Dorsey. Investigation's closed. Witnesses in town backed your story. Eli blinked. Just like that? Just like that. You've done enough penance for one lifetime. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. Take care, McCrae. Men like us, we don't get many chances at peace. Don't waste the one you've got left. When Eli rode back into the valley that evening, the light was gold and soft, the air full of birdsong. He dismounted near the creek and stood for a while, listening to the water, to the hum of life that refused to die. The cabin door opened. Clara stepped out, shading her eyes against the sun. When she saw him, her breath caught. He didn't speak at first, just walked up the porch steps and stopped in front of her. Well? She asked, voice trembling. It's done, he said. They're gone. Her shoulders sagged with relief. You came back. I told you I would. She smiled, and then this time it reached her eyes. You're a man of your word, Eli McCrae. He looked at her for a long moment, then reached up and brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. And you're the reason I started keeping them again. They stood like that while the sun slipped behind the ridge, the world wrapped in amber light. The air smelled of rain and wood smoke, and something new between them, something fragile, real and alive. When he finally spoke, it was almost a whisper. You could still leave. Clara, go find a better place than this rough patch of land. She smiled softly. There isn't one. He smiled back, a slow, quiet thing that felt like sunrise. Then I guess we're both home, he said. And as the light faded over the valley, the ghosts of their old lives faded with it, leaving only 2 people, standing together, learning at last how to stay. By the following spring, the cabin by the creek had become more than a refuge. It was home. The world around it had thawed and bloomed, turning the once bleak stretch of land into something almost tender. Aspen trees leafed gold in the sunlight, and the river ran high with melted snow, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Clara rose before dawn most mornings, just as Eli had taught her. She baked bread, tended the garden, and learned the rhythms of a life that belonged more to wind and soil than to fear. Eli worked the fence lines, mended the barn roof, and taught her how to read the trail signs of weather and wild things. There was peace between them now, not the brittle, uncertain kind born of silence, but something gentler, steadier. They still didn't talk much about what had come before. They didn't have to. Out here, words were less important than the quiet understanding that passed in a look. A touch, a breath shared under the same roof. One morning, a wagon appeared on the horizon. 2 oxen, 1 man, and a woman riding beside him. They came slow, cautious, as all newcomers did. Clara was hanging laundry when she saw them crest the ridge. Eli stepped out from the barn, rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He didn't raise it, not yet. The wagon stopped at the fence. The man tipped his hat. "Mornin'. Name's Samuel Price. This here's my wife, Evelyn. We're settling the plot south of the creek." Eli nodded, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Didn't think the county was selling that land yet." Price smiled. "They weren't till last month. Guess the law's catching up to the wilderness." The woman, small, red-haired, sharp-eyed, looked toward Clara and smiled. "You're the first friendly face I've seen since we left Cheyenne." Clara smiled back. "You've come a long way for a patch of dirt." Evelyn laughed. "Ain't that the truth?" Eli's gaze softened a little. "You'll find good soil here, but the weather's mean. Fence high, dig deep, and don't trust the wind." "Appreciate the warning," Price said. He offered a hand. "Good to have neighbors." Eli shook it firm and brief. Neighbors can be the difference between surviving and not. When the wagon rolled on, Clara watched it disappear into the green haze of the valley. "They seem kind," she said. Eli grunted. "Hope they stay that way." The Prices moved in quick. By midsummer, smoke curled from their new chimney and laughter drifted faintly across the creek. Clara took to visiting Evelyn in the afternoons, bringing fresh bread or preserves. They'd sit under the porch awning and talk about recipes, about home, about the kind of loneliness only women on the frontier truly understood. Sometimes Evelyn asked about Eli, about where he'd come from, what he'd done before. Clara always smiled and said, "He was a lawman once. Now he's just a good man." But gossip has long legs in new country. By autumn, word from town carried whispers of the shootout, of Danner's men, of the runaway bride who'd holed up with the reclusive rancher by the creek. The first time Clara overheard it in the general store, she froze, the same cold weight she thought she'd buried tightening in her chest. The women's voices were sharp, slick with judgment. No ring on her finger, they say. And he's old enough to be her father. Folks like that never change. Clara didn't speak. She just bought what she needed, lifted her chin, and walked out. But when she reached the wagon, her hands were shaking. Eli saw it as soon as she got home. "Bad trip?" he asked. She didn't answer at first. Then, setting the flour sack down too hard, she said, "They're talking about us." He didn't move. "They've been talking since the day I brought you here." "I know, but—" She turned, eyes bright with anger and shame. "I thought maybe it would fade, that what we built here would be enough to quiet them." Eli crossed the room, his hand resting lightly on her arm. "People in town don't live by creeks and fences, Clara. They live by stories. They need someone to talk about." "Let 'em," she swallowed hard. "You can say that. You've got nothing left to lose." He looked at her then, really looked, and in his eyes she saw hurt, deep and old. "You think I don't?" The silence that followed was raw, honest. Then she stepped forward, laid her palm against his chest, and said softly, "No. I think you've just learned how to carry it better." Winter came early that year, sharp and sudden. The wind howled down from the mountains, and ice crusted the creek before the first snow even fell. The Price's oxen died before Christmas, and Eli spent 3 days helping Samuel dig them out from under the drifts. When he came home the third night, half frozen and limping, Clara was waiting with hot coffee and a fire roaring so bright it turned the whole cabin gold. "You should have stayed in," she scolded softly, helping him out of his coat. "They'll get by." Eli shook his head. "He's got a wife and a baby on the way. I don't leave folks to freeze." She smiled, pressing the cup into his hands. "You never did." He drank slow, watching the firelight play over her face. Something in his chest loosened, something that had been clenched too long. "You ever wonder," he said quietly, "how all this happened? You and me this place." She glanced up, her expression soft. "Every day. And what answer do you get?" She reached over, tracing the rough scar on his knuckles with her thumb. "That sometimes God fixes a broken thing by giving it something else that's broken." Eli laughed quietly, the sound low and real. "And what do we call that? Providence or punishment?" "Neither," she said. "Grace." By spring, the Price's baby was born. A girl named Ruth with hair like spun gold and lungs that could shake the rafters. Clara helped deliver her, and Eli built a cradle out of pine from the ridge. For the first time in years, laughter returned to the valley. Children's laughter. Warm and high, life had turned again, quietly, gently. Sometimes Eli still woke in the night, the ghost pressing at the edges of sleep. But when he turned, Clara was always there, her hand finding his in the dark. They never spoke the words, love, forever home, but they lived them in every shared morning, every quiet evening, every small kindness that filled the silence. And though the world beyond the valley still whispered their names, it no longer mattered. For the first time, both of them knew peace wasn't the absence of ghosts. It was learning to live with them side by side.